Chapter 6. The Immediate Ripple, Impact on Their Contemporaries and the Follower Base. If the last chapter traced the stubborn silhouette of Heraclitus, the one who believed the world is in perpetual motion and that fire is the living emblem of change, then this chapter must attend to the tremor his presence produced in the crowded rooms of Ionian cities and in the minds of those who would soon call themselves his listeners, his rivals, or his heirs. The ripple was not a neatly printed thesis handed down to students. It was a gust stirred in public spaces, ports, markets, porticos where sailors and scribes crossed paths with artisans and priests. In that volatile environment, Heraclitus did not merely argue against the comfortable permanence of things. He introduced a new form of persuasion, a rhetoric of flux that demanded attention, memory, and a willingness to revise what counted as knowledge. The immediate aftermath was a tangle of responses, confusions, and glimmers, some flattering, many antagonistic, and several far more lasting than anyone in the moment could have anticipated. This is the story of that first weather system, the way his contemporaries heard him, and how a small, porous following began to take root around him, neither wholly embraced nor wholly rejected. The first thing we feel when stepping into the climate of early 5th century BCE Ionia is the sense of a culture in motion itself. The Milesian cities, Miletus, Ephesus, Colophon, and the places in between, were hubs where trade, poetry, and philosophical speculation moved as quickly as the ships that docked and sailed. People did not gather to hear a single, orderly system preached like a law. They gathered to hear a mind that spoke in paradoxes, in fragments that refused to settle into a single label, in images that could be watched and argued from every angle. Heraclitus required a form of attention that was more participatory than passive. His audience did not simply listen, they wrestled with the implications. That is how the first sparks appeared, as challenges to the reigning sensibilities of permanence, as invitations to test the reliability of the senses, and as a stubborn insistence that order and disaster are two faces of the same process. The marketplace of Ephesus was a natural arena for such a challenge. There, between the smells of brine and resin and the clang of blacksmiths at their anvils, a crowd gathered around a man who spoke in swift, telegraphic lines. He did not deliver a sermon. He offered a map that kept shifting. He would point, for example, to a flame-lit brazier and declare, in effect, that the brazier's brightness is a sign of something enduring only as long as it remains a spark, the fire itself continuously consuming and renewing itself. The listeners could not help but test this claim against their own experience. The brazier grows dim, the flame dies, new flame appears elsewhere. In that moment, a philosopher's habit, the habit of reframing experience, was born into a familiar scene. If you touched the flame and saw a burn, you might think a stable fact stood behind it. If you watched the flame flicker and yet the brazier remained, you were forced to admit that stability itself is a kind of appearance. The ripple began as such contradictions in public life, not in a library or a cloister. One of the most consequential effects of Heraclitus in those first years was the way his words changed the life of discourse among curious contemporaries who would later be called his followers. The early adherents did not form a gymnastic school or a fully fledged philosophical sect with a unified creed. Rather, they were a circle of listeners, scribes, sailors, artisans, and a few younger philosophers, who found themselves most excited when the philosopher's remarks could be maneuvered as tools for other inquiries, in metallurgy and shipbuilding, in the interpretation of dreams and omens, in political debate, and in the craft of poetry. They would take fragments, masticate them, and apply them to disparate problems. A captain asking how to manage a crew in changing weather, a potter trying to decide whether a vessel's beauty resides in its form or its function, a priest seeking to interpret rites as expressions of a reality that will not stand still. The immediate impact on their contemporaries is best understood in three interwoven strands: public reception, intellectual rivalry, and artisanal appropriation. Each thread reveals a different texture of influence. Public reception. The first eyes that fixed themselves on Heraclitus tended to do so with mixture of awe and alienation. Some listeners felt a certain exhilaration in hearing someone so uncompromising about change. Others, particularly those who had staked their authority on stable essences, the priests who safeguarded ritual objects, the poets who sought timeless arcs, the political figures who needed a steady order to govern, felt a chill. The philosopher's paradoxes required a cognitive posture that was unsettling, to accept that every account of reality is provisional, that even the most once-and-for-all statements must be repolished when new data appears, and that the truth of a thing lies less in what it is at this moment than in how it transforms in time. The most immediate reaction among many was to bracket such views as clever but dangerous. If a city's order depended on what is fixed, laws, oaths, sacred tokens, then the claim that all things are in flux could be read as a subversive invitation to change the order of things itself. There were indeed murmurs that Heraclitus was a cynic about all that people treasure: the gods, the legal framework, the social bonds that rely on shared conviction about the way things are. Yet there were others who heard a more utilitarian message in his words, that a prudent life must be prepared for flux, that the best laws and customs might be those most adaptable, and that wisdom includes learning what to keep and what to let go as circumstances change. Intellectual rivalry. The intellectual environment did not simply absorb novelty, it contested it. Heraclitus's ideas briefly unsettled the dominant currents. The Eleatic and Pythagorean threads already present in Ionian thought responded with vigor. Parmenides, the austere voice of the Eleatic tradition, would have disliked the sense that being is inseparable from becoming. Zeno, in particular, would have offered arguments designed to protect the safety of static, coherent reality by hyperbolically demonstrating that motion and plurality generate contradictions only because of flawed reasoning. Even if Zeno did not meet Heraclitus in direct dialogue, they belonged to different locales and traditions. The later generation of Eleatics and their followers would soon be drawn into a tight, difficult conversation with the Heraclitean position. Is change real or merely appearances? The debate would take the form of sharp, lucid exchanges, with each side presenting fragments of their own argument in a language that could be made precise enough to travel to Athens or Sicily several generations hence. In those early years, the encounters happened in taverns, porticoed streets, and the arguments that rose in the wake of festival crowds. They did not settle the matter, they intensified it, and in that sense they ensured that Heraclitus's ripple would not fade away quickly. His contemporaries learned to push against the edges of what could be claimed as universal and to test what could still be called knowledge when the world appeared to be a ceaseless process of becoming. Artisanal appropriation. The third strand, where the ripple took on a practical, almost tactile form, occurred among craftspeople and merchants who paid attention to the way materials transform under heat, pressure, or use. A smith who learned of Heraclitus might think of his craft as a perpetual pivot from one state to another. Iron, charcoal, and fire depended on one another in a dance of constant reformulation. A potter could hear the idea that a vessel's beauty lies not only in its shape, but in the way it endures through the heat and cooling of the kiln, the glaze's response to environment, and the eventual fragility of clay in time. In short, Heraclitus's insistence that everything flows provided a vocabulary for describing transformations that artisans already observed but did not always name with conceptual clarity. The artisan's language, how a material changes, how it is used, what its function becomes under different hands, could be extended by the philosopher's logic into a broader cosmology of transformation. The result was a small but persistent tradition of thought in which the craft of making and the craft of reason walked side by side, each sharpening the other. The follower base, the first generation of adherents, began to see themselves not as mere autodidacts who liked a good paradox, but as participants in a broader, more robust inquiry into the nature of reality, knowledge, and value. In this environment, a few early followers emerged that deserve a closer look. Not all of them left behind a clear philosophy in the polished form we would expect from a later school. Instead, they left behind habits of mind, fragments of dialogue, and the willingness to treat a problem from multiple angles. They practiced a way of listening to the world that valued how things change as a method of understanding what might count as truth. They did not seek to codify a single doctrine. They sought to cultivate a way of being in which questions outnumbered answers, and where the most durable claim was the humility to admit one's own provisional stance. Take, For instance, a pair of figures who appear in the later recollections of the era as something like witnesses to the birth of this improvised following. One is a shipwright's apprentice named Eudorus in a coastal town where the harbor never sleeps. He is not a philosopher in the formal sense, but he keeps a small notebook in a wax tablet on which he writes aphorisms he has overheard or formed by trial and error. He learns to measure the world by the degrees of heat and the change of material states, and begins to speak about human life in terms of heat and air and the turning of the wheel, as if human fortunes were subject to the same unceasing cycles as a hull drying in the sun. The other is a scribe named Thyra, a young woman who travels from city to city with a caravan of goods. She collects songs, proverbs, and snippets of conversation, stitching them into a mosaic that she claims can reveal the common logic of the world without relying on a single, rigid doctrine. For Thyra and Eudorus, Heraclitus's way of thinking becomes a template. See the world as process, notice the tension between opposites, and keep a pocket of doubt open to accommodate new events. They do not claim to own the truth, they claim to own a mode of inquiry. This modest but steadfast spirit is the seed of what later generations would call a follower base, an informal network who could articulate the resonance of a flux-based worldview across different domains of life. In those early contact zones, the earliest followers began to articulate a handful of recurrent motifs. The first motif is the primacy of change. Nothing endures in its current form long enough to claim true permanence. The second motif is the unity of opposites. Apparent contradictions contain a hidden order that can be teased into coherence by attention and a willingness to hold two incompatible statements together for a time. The third motif is the constitutional role of conflict. Strife is not a sign of disorder, but the engine that sustains the world's continual reconfiguration. The fourth motif, the most contentious, concerns the logos, a rational principle that orders events without fully determining them, a law that renders sense out of disorder but does not flatten variety into a single pattern. These motifs did not appear as a systematic doctrine at first. They arose as recurring, resonant ideas that listeners found useful, even indispensable, in particular circumstances. When a sailor returns from a voyage and finds the harbor transformed by the season's winds, or when a craftsman faces a new demand for work that cannot be met by last year's routines, the follower base has a ready response. Seek the pattern in flux, test it against experience, and adjust accordingly. What made the follower base durable, however, was not that they adopted Heraclitus as a master signifying a fixed truth, but that they learned to speak a certain language of change that could travel beyond their immediate circle. The language had a practical texture. It could be invoked to explain oscillations in weather that affected ships. It could be used to interpret shifts in political alliances. It could be woven into poetic lines that captured the immediacy of experience without pretending it amounted to a completed theory. The follower base never became a formal institution in those early days. Rather, they formed a school of phrasing. They learned to quote fragments in ways that invited interpretation rather than closure, to stage conversations in public spaces rather than in isolated academies, and to keep their debates open-ended enough to accommodate new cases as they appeared, whether in a shipyard or a temple or a festival ground. From the point of view of their contemporaries, the ripple also produced several overt tensions. The priests who managed sacred rites found themselves scrutinized. Their acts could be read as rituals that fixed reality by means of tradition rather than by a reasoned account of how change works. Some priests responded with defensiveness and revulsion, certain that to question the stability of the divine order was to threaten social cohesion. Others, more flexible, began to see in Heraclitus a provocative invitation to reform ritual life, to understand the ritual as a living process rather than as a static rite designed to confer continued legitimacy on a fixed hierarchy. The poets, those who fashioned lines to be sung at gatherings or recited at the boundaries of the city, found in his paradoxes a wellspring of metaphor. They could depict a world where the river does not hold fixed the same water twice, not as a nihilistic end, but as a reminder that the act of speaking about the world is itself a dynamic act of interpretation that must adapt with time. A poem could be an act of listening to the world's own process rather than an act of capturing it in a single, unchanging image. The political figures, sensing the unsettled minds of their constituents, began to test proposals that could survive change rather than rely on a single, enduring principle. In these modes of engagement, the ritual, the poetic, the political, the ripple took on a life of its own, moving with a pace and shape that a doctrine would not. As one might expect, not all who heard Heraclitus's words found themselves persuaded. Some were captivated by the intellectual challenge, but feared the social consequences of a worldview that seemed to undermine authority and consensus. Others found the message attractive but too abstract for practical application. A few, perhaps the decisive few by the accounts of later historians, recognized a strategic opportunity in the doctrine. If the world is always in flux, then the power to shape events lies not in securing a fixed truth, but in managing the contingencies of time. This instinct, articulated in various local idioms, sometimes in a boastful, sometimes in a cautious register, would become a central axis of the follower base. They learned to frame their argument as a capacity to adapt, to respond to change with agility, to read the signs of time, and act with a flexible prudence. It was not a revolutionary political program in any immediate sense, but it was a way of thinking that could be enlisted for diverse ends, to justify new economic arrangements, to defend innovative crafts, to reframe religious practice, or to reimagine the purposes of education. The ripple, in short, extended beyond metaphysics into the social texture of Ionian life. If we then ask, who counted as the core of that follower base in Heraclitus's own lifetime? The historical record is sparse and fragmentary, and what survives is more suggestive than explicit. What can be stated with reasonable reliability is that the group remained modest in size, dispersed in urban centers along the coastline, and deeply dependent on oral transmission and practical application. They did not yet possess a formal syllabus or a set of deduced propositions that could be tested in a classroom. Instead, they cultivated a shared habit of mind, a temperament of questioning, a readiness to see change in every assessment, and an insistence that argument must be tested against the world's continual display of becoming. They maintained a respectful, sometimes impatient relationship with the more traditional orders of knowledge, the religious authorities, the professional philosophers who argued within a more established framework, and the rulers who sought to preserve the stability of their cities. In other words, they walked a precarious line between subversion and adaptation, enough to keep Heraclitus's memory alive, not so bold as to topple the social structures that allowed Ionian culture to flourish. The most striking thing, perhaps, about the immediate ripple is how quickly the conversation ceased to be about a singular man and began to resemble a field of inquiry. The follower base were not his clones. They were porters of a style of thinking, and once their attention had been awakened, they carried the contents of their conversations in a variety of directions. Some pursued the problem of knowledge in a way that would anticipate later skeptics and empiricists by insisting on the primacy of experience and the velocity of perception. Others sought to reconcile Heraclitus with the notion of a rational order, attempting to reframe the logos as a principle that, rather than suppressing stability, organizes change in intelligible patterns. Still others looked to the aesthetic realm, where the idea of flux provided a powerful metaphor for the artist's task, to craft works that would survive in time not by capturing an immutable form, but by engaging the audience in a process of ongoing interpretation. The immediate ripple, thus, did not form a single, legible arc that could be followed easily from one fragment to the next. It formed a living mesh of conversations, across workshops, porticos, and harbors, in the notes of apprentices and scribes, in the speculative readings of poets who tested their lines against the world's transformative force, in the cautious deliberations of temple clergy who sought to understand what change meant for ritual and dogma. The ripple's power lay in its ambiguity, not its clarity. It provided a vocabulary that could be used by different people for different tasks, enabling a kind of philosophical agility that Ionian thinkers would increasingly prize in the centuries that followed. In the eyes of the contemporaries, Heraclitus did not deliver a doctrine. He offered a lens. And the lens, once learned, refused to be set aside. As the chapter closes, a recurring image returns to mind. The river, not as a fixed stream, but as a continuous channel through which a riverbed, its banks, and the surrounding landscape are forever rearranged. The famous maxim about stepping into the same river twice, if we grant the historical mood to the moment, is less about the river and more about the observer. The river, in Heraclitus's rhetoric, is a living metaphor for the whole of reality. The followers, this small, often anonymous cohort, learned to use that metaphor to navigate a world where nothing could be taken as finally settled. They did not dream of conquering change. They proposed to collaborate with it, to recognize its patterns when they could, and to hold steady long enough to bury in memory a few reliable ways of acting within it. In the broader arc of the book, this chapter's account of the immediate ripple offers a crucial transition. It shows how a single mind's insistence on perpetual becoming does not merely confuse or provoke, it seeds a new form of social learning. The follower base does not appear as a ready-made group with a defined program. It emerges as a network of listening, responding, and adapting that can travel across time and space. The ethical and epistemological implications of that shift would echo through later centuries. The recognition that knowledge is not a frozen inventory but a dynamic practice, that communities of inquiry are built as much by the capacity to engage with uncertainty as by the possession of certain truths, that a philosophy, Heraclitus's philosophy, can become, in effect, a living conversation rather than a closed system. If one asks what the portrait of Heraclitus looks like through the eyes of those who encountered him in his own hour, the answer is not a singular, definitive image. It is more like the impression of light that flickers through a crowded doorway, quick, fragmented, evanescent, yet potent enough to rearrange the room. The immediate ripple discovered in the contemporaries is not merely a reaction to a remarkable person. It is, in a robust sense, the first draft of a social and intellectual culture that would keep returning to the same questions. What does it mean for something to be real if it is always becoming? How do we know what we know when the ground beneath us is continually shifting? And, crucially, who are we as interpreters of that change? How do we listen? How do we argue? And how do we carry forward a conversation whose meandering path is, in its own way, a form of wisdom? Chapter 6 ends with an invitation to witness the seed of a tradition becoming a living practice. Heraclitus's immediate ripple did not crystallize into a neat doctrine, but it did something perhaps even more valuable. It trained eyes and ears to pay attention to the processes that weave the world together. It prepared a cadre of early followers to test, improvise, and translate a philosophy of flux into a form that could inhabit the bustling life of Ionian cities. And it left behind a question that would haunt thinkers for centuries. If everything flows, what remains to be said that is worth saying tomorrow? The answer, for those who would become later known as the Heracliteans in one form or another, was not an ending but a dedication to the art of remaining curious in motion. That is the imprint the immediate ripple left, a reminder that a single mind at a crossroads can spawn more lives than a moment's attention could ever have foreseen.